The Minister and Tema Consulting, they remind us of the potentials in international markets. Europe has seen a strong development in this sector over the last decade, and even if there are big market potential offshore Asian countries, like China, like Marius just said, Europe tends to look like the most promising market, most obvious market for Norwegian suppliers to focus on. We are extremely glad that we have with us Mr. Giles Dickson. He's the CEO of Wind Europe. Wind Europe is an important player in the wind sector in Europe. They are a member organization with more than 400 companies in 35 countries. We talked to Giles. He's very enthusiastic about the wind development in general, but also the offshore wind development. We talked to him earlier this week, and here is his reflections on how he thinks offshore wind will help Europe go carbon neutral. He will join us live after this presentation, so please continue to send in your questions via slido.com. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Where is wind energy in Europe today? The blue bars are the gigawatts of wind energy capacity installed in each country, onshore and offshore combined. The red bars are the share of wind energy in every country's electricity mix. Germany has the most installed capacity. Denmark has the highest share of wind in its electricity mix. Wind is now 15% of all of the electricity that we consume in Europe. This is onshore and offshore wind combined, and the vast majority of it is onshore. How much of this is offshore? There we are. But it's growing rapidly, driven by rapid reduction in costs. That is a spectacular story of cost reduction in offshore wind in Europe over the last 6 years. And this is driven more than anything by developments in technology. The turbines are getting larger. The costs of building new offshore wind farms is now the second cheapest form of new power generation capacity in Europe, second only to onshore wind, at least in northwest Europe. And this is reflected now in the plans governments have for the evolution of their electricity mix. Look at how the International Energy Agency sees Europe's electricity mix evolving over the next 30 years. Offshore wind will become the #1 source of our electricity, followed by onshore wind. What does this mean for the expansion of wind energy capacity? Well, this is how much we have today. The dark blue is onshore, the light blue is offshore. In 2030, that's what we'll have, and this is what the EU say they want us to have in 2050. Big expansion in offshore wind, that's the light blue. An even bigger expansion in onshore wind capacity, in fact. Now, let's look at those offshore wind expansion numbers. Here they are. Today, we are building 3 gigawatts of new offshore wind farms in Europe every year. To get to 450 gigawatts by 2050, we'll need to be building 18 gigawatts of new offshore wind farms every year. So we need to invest massively in our supply chain. Now, where are we going to put 450 gigawatts of offshore wind? We have studied where it makes most sense economically, given where the energy demand is, given the geographical potential, and this is our conclusion. Over 200 gigawatts in the North Sea, over 80 in the Baltic, but significant amounts also in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Let's now look at the expansion in offshore wind over the next 10 years alone. The green is the United Kingdom. The dark blue is Germany. You see, Poland starts to build offshore wind as well. Norway, we are counting in the grey that's at the top of each of these bars. Most of all of this will continue to be bottom-fixed offshore wind, but we'll start to see our first floating offshore wind farms as well. Because, remember, the geography. We can only do bottom-fixed conventional offshore wind in the red areas. That's where the sea is less than 50 meters deep. Everywhere else, it's got to be floating. The technology has already come of age. It is already being deployed. Here, Equinor's project, the world's first floating offshore wind farm, those 5 turbines off the coast of Scotland. Now we have a second in Portugal. By 2030, we expect to have 7 gigawatts of floating offshore wind operating in Europe. And we agree with Equinor. We can get the costs down to around 40 to 60 euros a megawatt hour by 2030. The key thing is how much floating offshore wind we are building. The quicker we can get to 10 gigawatts and then 20 gigawatts, the more we will reduce the costs, the more quickly we'll reduce the costs. So there's going to be much more floating offshore wind. Another thing that's going to change in offshore wind is the grid connections. Today, every offshore wind farm has one single point-to-point grid connection back to the mother country, but that is about to change. Here we have Kriegers Flak in the Baltic, which has grid connections both to Germany and to Denmark, and we hope it will have one to Sweden as well. There'll be many more of these so-called hybrid offshore wind farms in the future. Let's look and see what hybrid offshore wind farms are currently being planned. There we have Kriegers Flak. Here we have a plan to connect offshore wind farms in Dutch and British waters. Then the Danish, Dutch and German governments are developing plans. Estonia and Latvia want to do it. Denmark and Poland have plans. And then finally, there are plans to develop a big hub around the Dogger Bank in the middle of the North Sea, into which your own offshore wind farms could connect as well. These hybrid offshore wind farms, some of them might have connections also to the electricity interconnectors between countries that exist or are being developed. I mentioned the Denmark-Poland hybrid project. It's actually based around Bornholm Island. And the plan is to build offshore wind farms close to Bornholm, have AC connections into Bornholm, and then DC connections to Denmark and to Poland. They're also thinking of putting electrolyzers on Bornholm. So you might be carrying not just electricity to Denmark and Poland, but also renewable hydrogen in gas pipelines. Here we have a TenneT vision of what the North Sea might look like. They want to build artificial islands there and platforms. You can see the hubs here. The blue lines are electricity cables. The yellow lines are gas pipelines, some of them existing. And TenneT's plan with Gasunie, the Dutch gas TSO, is to have electrolyzers on some of these artificial islands and platforms and to carry not only electricity back to the mainland, but also renewable hydrogen. So offshore wind is going to be used quite a lot for renewable hydrogen, especially for industrial applications like here in the northern part of the Netherlands. We're going to need to invest significantly, not just in our supply chain, but also in port infrastructure as we expand offshore wind. The blades of the new turbines are over 100 meters long. You've got to invest in space in your ports. You've then got to invest in heavy loading bays, in deep berths for the jackup vessels. All these ports around Europe are involved in offshore wind. They're all members of Wind Europe. We would strongly encourage you to be thinking hard about your own port investments in Norway as you expand offshore wind. And finally, we need to think about happy coexistence between offshore wind and other societal interests and economic sectors that have a stake in the sea. Fishing, shipping, environmental interests, military interests. Here we have an example of passive fishing taking place close to an offshore wind farm. Why not? Let's have multiple use of the sea space. Finally, just to illustrate what I'm saying, how complex the maritime spatial planning can be, this is Belgium's EEZ, their territorial waters. The red diagonal lines are their offshore wind farms. You can see how carefully they're having to plan how they coexist with their shipping lanes, their fishing areas, their environmental and military zones. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Maritime spatial planning, new forms of grid connections, a greater role for floating offshore wind, and cheap and reliable offshore wind, helping to deliver the energy transition in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giles Dickson. He will join us here. There you are, Giles. Welcome. Nice to see you again. How are you? We can't hear you, so just give it 1 second.
Good morning.
There we are, Giles. Nice to see you again. How are you?
Very well, and yourselves?
I'm fine, thank you. We're here to discuss offshore wind, and we've just seen your very enthusiastic presentation, so thank you very much for that. My first question to you is, you're talking about an ambition of offshore wind in Europe by 450 gigawatt by 2015. And you raised the question that we need to have a massive investment in order to get there. What are the bottlenecks in this ambition? What would you need to solve?
We've got to invest in grid infrastructure. That is clear. We've got to invest in the supply chain. Today, the offshore wind supply chain in Europe is building 3 gigawatts of new offshore wind turbines every year. It actually has the capacity to build up to 7 gigawatts every year with our existing factories. But we need to be installing up to 18 gigawatts every year in the 2030s and 2040s to get to that number of 450 gigawatts, which is the goal that the European Union has set for the whole of Europe. So we need to expand the supply chain. We need to invest in grids. We need to invest in our port infrastructure, as I've just said in my presentation. We need to ensure also that governments have the right policy framework for supporting offshore wind financially. This does not mean subsidies. What it does mean is ensuring that those developing offshore wind farms have a perspective of stable revenues, and that they can then go to the banks and to the equity investors who see that perspective of revenue stability, and they will be ready to lend money to those projects at affordable costs of finance. In most countries in Europe, that will mean two-sided contracts for difference coming out of auctions. It could be that model in Norway. It may be a different model to that in Norway, but certainly the investors need to have this perspective of stable revenues.
And building on your perspective on banks and access to capital, you have 400 members. Do you see access to capital being a challenge in the wind energy, or is it now the bubble of the week?
Look, there's plenty of capital out there that wants to invest in offshore wind under the right conditions. That's the key, under the right conditions. If governments say, okay, offshore wind, the costs have come down, it looks pretty cheap now, just do this in complete market conditions, off you go. And you try building an offshore wind farm and you go to the banks and they say, okay, so what's your revenue base? And you say, well, it's the wholesale electricity price. And what's that going to be? Why, I don't really know. And then they're much more reluctant to lend to that project. And then you need to put more equity into the projects. And that may be a challenge for many developers of wind farms. Certainly your overall capital costs will be much higher in that perspective.
The bank will answer for that later this afternoon, so we'll make sure to ask them what they need in order to give you the money. But building on, you talk about cost reduction and going to floating wind, because a lot of us here in Norway is interested in the Norwegian adventure. You say in order to get the cost down, we need tempo, we need more volume in order to get down to 40 to 60 euro per megawatt hour. What should be the next step now?
Okay, so we have 2 very small floating offshore wind farms in operation today in Europe, one in Scotland, one in Portugal. By the end of 2022, we will have quite a few more small-sized floating offshore wind farms operating. In total, we'll have over 300 megawatts of floating offshore wind operating in Europe by the end of 2022. And we're assuming in that Tampen high wind as well. By 2030, if you look at plans that governments have today, including the government of Norway, we expect that there will be 7 gigawatts of floating offshore wind operating in total. We are assuming that as part of that 7 gigawatts, Utsira is developed with 1.5 gigawatts, and we're assuming that half of the southern North Sea zone that your government has identified will have floating offshore wind turbines operating as well. So that's 3 gigawatts out of the 7 that we are assuming for Norway by 2030, okay? Now, when you've got to that sort of scale in the market, 7 gigawatts, you're close to having the economies of scale you need to deliver those Equinor LCOE targets of somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 euros per megawatt hour, certainly for the most competitive projects. We believe that by 2050, there could and should be somewhere between 100 and 150 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in Europe. So that's nearly 1/3 of the total offshore wind that Europe will have by 2050. Now, why do we say that? It's mainly because of the level of interest and ambition that we are now seeing from governments right across Europe to develop offshore wind. Spain is developing an offshore wind strategy. So is Greece. France has big ambitions for floating offshore wind. They want to be the market leader and the industrial leader in Europe. And in fact, France next year is running the world's first large-scale auction for a floating offshore wind farm. So offshore wind is becoming a whole Europe affair. It's no longer just something for the North Sea or the Baltic Sea countries. And clearly, in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, if you want to do offshore wind, you've got to do floating because of the geography. And this will drive huge market opportunities for the Norwegian floating offshore wind industry.
I'm glad you closed by that, because that is the last question that we have time for. Giles here says this brings a lot of opportunities to the Norwegian suppliers. Thank you, Giles, for joining us from Brussels. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure being with you.
It seems like offshore wind is getting an issue for the whole Europe, and then for sure Norway is part of Europe. So we need to follow closely what's happening. One of the companies that needs to deliver on the ambitions that Mr. Dickson and the minister highlights is Equinor. And their CEO, like Kari said earlier today, their CEO, Anders Opedal, increased their ambitions on carbon neutrality when he took over earlier this week. We will talk to the guy who is responsible for building business on these new energy solutions. So I think it's fair to say that Equinor's wind adventure started in small scale, testing new technology, but now they're determined to become a global offshore wind energy major. We talked to Paul Eitrheim, their Executive Vice President for New Energy Solutions, and he will present his thoughts on how to get there. And Paul will join us afterwards, so please go to slido.com and ask your questions. This is your chance to get an answer from Paul. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm so happy that we were actually able to arrange this conference even during very challenging times. And due to COVID restrictions, this is a taped recording, but I look forward to joining you live for the Q&A session afterwards. History is packed with skeptics proven wrong. Before the 1952 Olympics in Oslo, Norway opposed cross-country skiing for women. In 1958, Norway's geological survey concluded that there was no chance of finding oil on the Norwegian continental shelf. And in 1971, 1/3 of the Norwegian Storting voted against the introduction of color TV in Norway. What these things have in common is that with the benefit of hindsight, they all look pretty silly. We now stand in front of one of the biggest energy transitions in history. Looking ahead, we see decades of renewables growth. We are looking at one of the biggest industrial opportunities in our lifetimes. And with it comes the opportunity to transform and reinvent ourselves as countries, as regions, as municipalities, and as companies. But once again, the skeptics are in ample supply. Norway doesn't need offshore wind. Offshore wind is too expensive and needs economic support, and it will take a long time before floating offshore wind takes off. We are indeed up against the unique Norwegian paradox. It's probably the world's best place from a wind resource point of view, and it's possibly the worst place from a market point of view. We are a small domestic market, which, at least for now, is oversupplied with relatively cheap renewable power. So in many ways, the skeptics are right. Norway does not need offshore wind right now, but the world does. It will need offshore wind at scale to deliver on its climate targets. And we will need offshore floating wind to deliver on our renewable ambitions. So here is an alternative way of looking at it. Offshore wind could be $1 trillion industry by 2040. Offshore wind could create 1 million jobs in Europe by 2050, and offshore wind can develop from a 30 gigawatt industry today to a 1,000 gigawatt industry in 2050. And floating offshore wind could be a multi-billion dollar industry within this decade. 80% of the world's offshore wind resources will require floating solutions. Auctions are already on the way in France and in Scotland, and several companies, including Equinor, are now measuring wind offshore Korea. If developed at scale, I'm convinced that the cost of floating wind will come down faster and more than many skeptics assume today. And I see no reason why Norway and Rogaland should not take global pole position on floating wind. Equinor has spent more than a decade developing its offshore wind capabilities and our portfolio. We plan to grow our capacity tenfold by 2026 and 30 times by 2035. And we now have a project pipeline in execution of some 3 to 4 gigawatts by 2026. We have worked on floating offshore wind since 2009, and to us, this is proven technology. When Hywind Tampen comes online in 2022, we will operate around 1/3 of the installed floating capacity in the world. And it was very good to see the Norwegian Prime Minister cut first steel at Kværner Stord on 5th of October this year. So let's have a look at a short movie about the Hywind Tampen project.
Det startet med en flytende vindturbin utenfor Karmøy. I 2017 startet driften på verdens første flytende vindpark utenfor Skottland. Høsten 2020 starter vi sammen med våre partnere byggingen av Hywind Tampen, som skal forsyne Tampenfeltet med fornybar strøm. Den vil bli verdens største flytende vindpark. Hywind Tampen-prosjektet vil bidra til videre utvikling av flytende havvindteknologi og redusere kostnadene ved fremtidige havvindparker.
Vi ser jo det her som en god investering for ikke bare Enova, det her er jo for nasjonen Norge, fordi at det er med å bringe en teknologi videre som vi har stor tro på at vi kan tjene på i fremtiden. Vi kan tjene på den fordi at det kan være et springbrett for olje- og gassindustrien og leverandørindustrien i Norge inn i nye markeder. Men på lang sikt så besitter jo også Norge noen fantastiske vindressurser, så bare teknologien blir billig og god nok, så har vi også muligheter til å tjene på krafta en gang i fremtiden.
Betongkonstruksjonen skal bygges av Kværner på Stord og Dommersnes, før de slepes til Wergeland base i Gulen for montering. I 2022 starter vi sammenstillingen av de 11 vindturbinene.
Hywind Tampen er et stort og komplekst offshore-prosjekt som vi i Equinor har stor kompetanse og lang erfaring på å levere. Sikkerhet er prioritet nummer 1, og vi i Hywind Tampen har fokusert på sikkerhet fra første dag for å unngå å få hendelser i prosjektet.
En etter en skal vindturbinene slepes ut til Tampenfeltet, som ligger ca. 140 km fra land. Når turbinene er på Tampenfeltet, vil de bli forankret opp. Kablene skal så legges for å koble de sammen og knyttes opp til plattformene Snorre og Gullfaks. Vindparken skal styres fra kontrollrommet til Equinor på Sandsli. Vindkraftprognosene sendes kontinuerlig til plattformene, slik at de kan utnytte det fulle potensialet til vindkraften. Dette vil redusere utslippene av CO2 tilsvarende rundt 100 000 biler. Sammen skaper vi et nytt norsk industrieventyr i et lavutslippssamfunn.
I really love that movie. In that movie, we saw Øyvind Leistad from Enova talk about this as a good investment. The support from Enova was absolutely crucial in order to realize this project. But it's worth noting that Enova did not support this project because Norway needed the power. They supported it because the world needs the technology, and they supported it because it is a unique chance to put our industry in pole position for what is going to be a significant growth market in the future. I'm really happy to see that around 50% of the contracts have gone to Norwegian suppliers in the Hywind Tampen project. Kværner, Subsea 7, Wood, Wergeland, just to mention a few of the companies that are involved. And some 1,500 to 3,000 people will be involved in the Hywind Tampen project through the lifetime of the project. On our side, as the operator for Hywind Tampen, our main goal is to reduce the cost, and we are targeting a 40% reduction in the cost per megawatt in Hywind Tampen. And I'm pleased to say that so far, so good. We are not quite there yet, but at least we are making quite good progress. Equinor's ambition as a company is to make floating offshore wind competitive by 2030. Continuous deployment and scale will be key to reduce the costs, like it has been for bottom-fixed turbine in different parts of the world. As an example, in the UK, we have seen the contract cost or contract prices coming down 80% in less than a decade. To reduce cost, we need more and we need bigger projects. It's that will allow us to industrialize and capture synergies of scale. And nothing would make me happier than doing the next big project in Norway. So what does it take? Industry must use this opportunity of Hywind Tampen to maximize the learning and reduce cost. We must continue to improve the technology and optimize the supply chain. But it's important that Hywind Tampen becomes the first and not the last offshore wind project on the Norwegian continental shelf. We should develop new ideas for offshore wind power to oil and gas installations. We should mature offshore wind projects aimed at exporting renewable power to Europe, and we should work on options for green hydrogen production in Norway. Norway has taken a first and important step by making acreage available at Utsira Nord and the Sørlige Nordsjø 2 area. This is good, and it could be the start of new and bigger developments. Access to acreage is indeed a necessary but insufficient condition for offshore wind in Norway. We need to articulate a long-term industrial ambition for offshore wind. We need to establish a competitive and predictable framework for offshore wind, and we need industrial cooperation across the world-class Norwegian offshore cluster. Building an industry will not come without challenges, and it will not come for free. The long-term reward is market share of a new global growth industry. To me, it is obvious that Rogaland can play a key role in the energy transition. We can build on 50 years of offshore and maritime experience. We punch above our weight when it comes to large, complex offshore developments. We have world-class companies and capabilities. We have the capital and the competence base from oil and gas. We even have a secret sauce. That is the ingenuity and the work ethic of the Siddis, the Gauk, and the Jærbu. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions, comments, and your challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I just encourage you to go to slido.com and ask your questions if you have one. Hey, Paul, nice to see you.
Good morning, nice to see you too.
It was interesting reflections you had there, and I really liked that your point that this is your biggest opportunity of your lifetime. And building on that, there's a lot of talk about we need to make sure we get the synergies right between oil and gas traditionally and into offshore wind. And you've done this. What has been your greatest advantages from an operator perspective?
No, I think Giles in his introduction referred to the IEA and the synergies between Marius actually referred to the synergies, and they are significant, and we are living it and seeing it every day. And coming from the oil and gas side of Equinor into the renewables, I'm struck by how much of that base capability we have as a company and as a supplier industry we can actually deploy into the offshore wind space in particular. I think there is one additional point to something that's been said earlier today, and that is that these projects are getting bigger and they're getting more complex. And that experience we have of developing large and complex offshore projects, I think is something that is really going to benefit us going forward. I also think that some of that balance that we bring in from a financial point of view, as these investments grow bigger, is also something that is going to put us in a good competitive position going forward. And then lastly, I think floating is definitely an extension from the offshore experience that we have. That is not something where you can easily move into if you don't have that offshore experience.
And building on that, it's almost an expectation to Equinor that you should bring the Norwegian supply chain to wherever you go in the world, into the international value chain. What can you do, and what does the supply chain need to do themselves?
I think they need to continue doing what they've been successfully doing for decades, and that is to effectively compete, because obviously we can't favor particular suppliers simply because of the color of their passport. But I spent half of my career in Equinor outside of Norway, and I'm yet to meet suppliers who are not prepared to actually compete in international competitions, and they are very competitive. So I wouldn't be worried about Norwegian suppliers and their competitiveness. But I do think there is one big nuance in this game compared to the oil and gas side. Cost matters relatively more than what it does on the oil and gas side. You don't have the margins to be able to operate in the same way as you do on the oil and gas side. But anything I've seen so far so good, I would say.
I'm glad to hear, and the messages keep your cost under control. There's a question here from one of the audience. I mean, you focus a lot on shaping the energy system and connecting the different dots of the energy system. There's a question here: do you see green hydrogen generating from offshore wind as an opportunity for Equinor's operation and future development?
So we have our primary approach so far to hydrogen has been on the blue side. That is basically carbon capture and storage from our natural gas position. And we think that that is actually probably an easier route to develop that value chain. But we don't see green and blue as competing. We think that they're going to benefit from many of the same markets. They're going to benefit from much of the same infrastructure, etc. So I think that we are positioning in both. We have been positioning in blue, as is well known publicly, and we're also pursuing options for green, because obviously green hydrogen has some benefits in terms of balancing and seasonal storage, etc. That you need to link back to your offshore wind position, for instance.
I have to say, I mean, you're taking a strong position and trying to really educate people that we need to connect the dots. This is oil and gas being fueled by offshore wind electricity. You have the Northern Light project connecting different parts of different industries. So shaping the system is important. But we are on the edge of developing Norway, and there is an application round coming up. What would you say is your expectation for what we see to come, and do you have some recommendations for the politicians that they can take home with them?
I think I had the pleasure of listening to Giles just before me, and I think he hit a lot of the same notes that I would repeat. And he used the word predictability in terms of revenue, etc. And that is definitely key also from my point of view. And then in our case, when it comes to Norway, that is to get a framework in place where we have that predictability of how this industry will be developed going forward. So from my point of view, most important now over the next few years, that is to get started. The single biggest challenge to now move the needle on cost on floating wind, that is to scale it up. We really need to industrialize that supply chain. And there are, as Giles was alluding to, there are countries already preparing auctions. Norway has opened up. I think there will be quite a bit of interest in this space going forward. But this is something we can't learn by seminars and PowerPoints. We actually need to do industrial developments to get that experience and bring the cost down.
I very much agree with you. There's a question here before we close. You talk about local content, and I hear you say for the Hywind Tampen you have 50% local content. What does it? Could you expand on Equinor's commitment to ensure this local industry when you go into offshore wind development?
I can't make a generic commitment because this is a competitive market, and obviously Norwegian suppliers are competing in an international market. But so I would rather turn around and say I'm confident that if Norwegian suppliers really put their effort into it, they will be competitive. There are some segments where I think the train has left the station. So, for instance, there was a discussion earlier about turbines, etc. That, to me, is a battle not worth fighting. But in terms of marine competence, in terms of project execution, in terms of foundation, installations, maritime things, this is still very much an industry in the making. And that is why I think it is important to get on with it now. Because the longer we wait, the less competitive we actually are going to be. And also that link back to the oil and gas industry is going to weaken if we defer this out in time.
Paul, you started by saying, I was a bit surprised, but you started by saying that Norway doesn't need offshore wind, but the world does, and it's our responsibility to help the technology in order to get the costs down and be ready for the opportunity that comes. We are ready to take the pole position. And Paul, thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.